Hey, welcome to Let It Be. I'm Vanessa, and this is my little corner of music YouTube. So today I'm going to do a good old-fashioned haul video of stuff that I've brought into my collection over the last couple months, mostly through Christmas, and as well, my birthday is close to Christmas, so it's really the time of year where I bring a lot in all at once. So it's worth talking about and showing. As well, I'm going to talk a little bit about my favorite albums from 2024. Since I didn't do a year-end video, maybe I should have, but it was a really busy time when a lot of the list videos were coming out, so I just didn't get to it, but I do have a list. I actually have a top 100 list. Obviously, I'm not going to rattle that all off here today, but I'll just talk about a few of my favorites because that also ties into some of the things that I've acquired over the last few months. So first of all, if this is going to be more vinyl than my last haul video, I know that one was quite CD centric. I do collect both, but I've brought in a lot more vinyl recently than CDs. So I guess I'll start with the CDs though to get those out, not out of the way because they're just as important as the records, but I'll just start with the CDs. So first of all, from a recent trip to my favorite record store, I ended up with Moxie, the debut from a Canadian hard rock band. What really led me to check them out in the first place is that Tommy Bolin plays several solos on the album because they were recording close to him when he was recording his teaser album, which we'll talk about a little later. And that's what led me to check this out. But I really liked it. It's just a solid 70s hard rock album. And yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm sure he helps, but the band themselves is very energetic and there's some good songs on here. So when I saw it at the store, I was glad to pick it up. Next up is a Christmas present that I got, and that is The War on Drugs and Lost in the Dream. Probably my favorite album from them so far. It's just filled with great songs and it's a grower. It's one that gets better and better each time I hear it and each time the songs just gel for me. There's some really great songs on here like Red Eyes, Suffering, Under the Pressure, just open the album and really bring you into it. And it's a mood, of course. It's you got to be into the vibe and everything, but I really like them, and they've just been really growing on me as I listen to them more, just overall, their discography. So, but this is probably their best so far. But happy to see what they've got coming in the future. Okay. Next up is actually a box set that I found out about through Shindig magazine, which I subscribe to and I read every month. And this was one of their best box sets of the year. And they also promoted it a little bit in some issues before that. They did some tie-in articles and stuff. And that is the Pour a Little Sugar on It compilation, which is all centered around bubblegum music from 1966 to 1971. So this is the perfect kind of packaging for this type of genre, which is very singles based, of course. And it just collects a lot of different things. Like they have some of the songs that you know, of course, like of course they have the Archies on here and the 1910 Fruit Gum Company and stuff like that. But they also have more obscure stuff, and a lot of them share lineage, of course. They all come from come from the same pool for the most part. The booklet is really quite helpful because they go through everything. It's a good size, and they talk about each song and why they put it on here and a little bit of the history around it and the personnel, which is really helpful and interesting, especially where there's are some selections on here that when you look at them, you're a bit like, what? That they have a Velvet Underground song in here, which is a little bit of a strange choice. I mean, nobody associates the Velvet Underground with bubblegum music. And even their reasoning, it's a little bit of a stretch, but it's a great song. Of course, the song that they have on here is Who Loves the Sun. And that's a great song, although it's more of a pop song than it is what you would consider bubblegum. But I guess there's always some choices on these box sets where you're a little bit like, I don't know about that, but it adds to the ambiance, I suppose. There's 91 songs on here, so it's a lot. Like I obviously have not sat and listened to it in one sitting. That is way too much. I've broken it down a disc at a time. It's 3 discs, of course. And even those all have like 30 songs on them. And by the end of them, even within the songs that I like, there's still some songs that's like, okay, I've had enough of this sound for right now. But it's a great time for pop music. I know at the time this stuff certainly was not cool, I'm sure. And it's more that it's just in retrospect, you realize that these are really solid pop songs and they're enjoyable. Of course, there's some clunkers throughout. I mean, it's 91 songs. Yeah, it's unavoidable. But I'm glad I picked it up. I really love these little box sets that go into a scene or a genre and really micro focus on it and give you some obscurities along with some of the better known songs. So this is a great set. And of course, it's from the Cherry Red umbrella. So they always seem to know what they're doing. Next up, something I picked up used just one time at my favorite record store, and that is the Chinese album by Spacehog, which was on my 1998 top 25 when I made one. I still haven't made a video about that, but I will one of these days. But it's an album that's just a really solid album from someone I actually considered probably more of a one-hit wonder before this, but it's nice to learn that they had more in the tank than just In the Meantime, which was on their previous album, of course. So this is just a fun, glammy rock album in a time where that just was not really happening. So it was a breath of fresh air. So happy to pick it up finally. And next, I have one that probably makes some people roll their eyes. I know it's not a very beloved album, but I appreciate it a lot. And that is David Bowie's self-titled debut. Self-titled debut. It's very different, obviously, from everything that he does after, of course. You can't go into it expecting Ziggy Stardust. Like, it's a totally different thing. But it's just got this charm to it that I just cannot resist. And it's so quirky and silly and weird. And I think he pulls it off. And I think there's some great songs on here. Like, I don't know. I don't really get the hate for it, but I do at the same time. I understand it's very different. But I found it very cheap, so I could not resist picking it up. I think it's a lot of fun. Obviously, not among my favorite David Bowie albums, but still one that I really like. So, and next, I have a collection called You and I from Jeff Buckley, someone I've talked about a few times on here. I love his brief output a lot. I was happy to see this. I really love his version of the Smiths' I Know It's Over. I think it's absolutely wonderful, and that is on here. So that was really my main draw to pick this up. But I'm excited to check out the rest of it as well. He does some other covers, including Everyday People by Sly and the Family Stone, which is another song I love. Interested to see his take on it. So that'll be cool. It was a bit of a chance, this one. I usually know what I'm getting when I buy things, but this one was a little bit of a chance I took. But at the end of the day, I'm sure it'll be worth it because I at least love I Know It's Over, and I have kind of come into collecting everything that I can from Jeff Buckley, so it just adds to that. Next up is one of my favorite albums of 2023 that I finally just came across randomly at my local mall, and that is Echo the Diamond by Margaret Glaspie. Just a really solid rock album. She's a really cool guitarist. She's a great songwriter, and yeah, I was super happy to come across this. It was a bit unexpected, and just happy to own it. Next up is one that was really on my wish list when I was searching for stuff recently, an albums that I have recently just totally fallen in love with from a band that I sort of overlooked before. This is a reissue set because their albums from this time period are not the easiest to come across from what I can see. That is Humble Pie, and this collects their first 2 albums from the Immediate label, which of course folded a long time ago. And this is an official set from the rights holder in Europe. I did all my research to make sure I wasn't getting some random collection from some sketchy source, because even the album's Town and Country is on streaming 3 different times, and one time it's misspelled, and like it's a little weird. The rights, but how I don't know how well held the rights to these albums are, so I just wanted to make sure I wasn't getting just some junky compilation from some, anyway, you know what I'm saying. But the one thing I really appreciated about this one is that it has both albums. It has Town and Country and it has As Safe as Yesterday Is. And it has them the proper track listing on two separate discs, and everything is properly arranged and as if you're just getting the albums. Because I hate these compilations that will collect multiple albums and they'll mix up the whole track listing and they'll put them all messed up on there. I want the track listing. So that was what made me buy this one. The cover, not the greatest, so that's why I did a little research before picking it up, but I'm happy to report it sounds good, it's the right stuff, and it's just what I wanted. So there'll be more about them soon coming up. The last CD I have for now, anyway, is Caribou by Elton John, which I think is an overlooked gem in his classic period, which, I mean, it makes sense. He had a lot of great albums in that time period and a lot of great songs. So this one, I guess it's a little more challenging. It takes a little more time to get into because it's a bit of a weird album. I'm not going to pretend that it's not. And it even took me a little bit to be like, to really see and appreciate it. But it's one that really grew on me. And once it did, I really came to appreciate its oddness and its uniqueness within his catalog in that time. His songwriting was still top notch at the time, and his band was still top notch. So yes, it gets overlooked because it is different. But I think there is, if you spend the time with it, there's some great songs on here. Like You're So Static. I've Seen the Saucers. Ticking is a classic, and that's a great song, just something totally different. And yeah, it does get overlooked a lot. So I was really happy to find it and add it to my collection. It was definitely missing. Next, I am going to be getting into the records that I've gotten the last little bit. This is a good haul. It's a bit plentiful. Just because of the time of year, I don't expect to be bringing too much more in the next little while. So I'm going to enjoy this while it lasts. And I've just brought in some great stuff. So I'm going to share that now. Starting with someone who I talked about in my last haul video because I'd gotten a bunch of his CDs but I was missing my absolute favorite album by him. And I'm happy to report that I picked it up not too long after, actually. And that is End of Amnesia by M. Ward. And this album is it's just stunning. He's one of those singer-songwriters that just hits me in such a way that there's like a special spot in my heart for some of these people, and he fulfills that. Like he's in that league for me with Nick Drake and Elliott Smith and people like that, who I just absolutely love, and I'm just connected to their music and their voices and their songwriting, and he really fits into that. And I've just fallen in love with his music this past year. I always, liked what I heard before that, but doing a dive of his albums really made me realize just how much I love him and how much he's just great. So was super excited to get my favorite album, which I have listened to so much over the course of the last 6 months. So I think it was one of my most played albums last year, which is saying something. I listen to a lot of music, and I don't do a lot of repeat plays because of that, really. So to have something really override everything else like this album has is just super special, and I'm happy to own it now. Next up is another album I've been looking for a while because I really love it, and I was super excited to find it, and that is Teaser by Tommy Bolin, which I did say earlier that I would be talking about again after talking about Moxie. This is a newer reissue of this, apparently only 500 copies of this edition. It is a purple vinyl, not the biggest I'm not the best at showing this stuff, but I guess I will for this one. But yeah, it's just this really cool purple. It's kind of got like a little smoky effect in it. I mean, I don't think that's going to pick up on here, but it's really neat. But really at the end of the day, I'm not that worried about the color vinyl thing. I'm just happy to have a copy of the album, and this just happened to be this special edition, so I'll take it. I will take it in whatever format it comes. I'm going to be doing a dive of 1975 this year, and I expect that it will place well in the list, but we'll see. Something else that I picked up recently, which I talked about very recently in my Cars video, and that is Panorama, of course, which is my Number two favorite Cars album, an album I have grown to absolutely adore. And did not own it, which was a crime. So I had to right that wrong and get my own copy of it, and here it is. And to tie in with that, at the same time, I ended up picking up Elliot Easton's solo album, which is, if you watch the video, you know that that is one of my favorite solo Cars albums. So I found it at my local record store really quite cheap. So I had to snatch it up because I don't think it's something I'm going to find too often out there. So yeah, happy to add those. Next up is a Christmas gift, an album that I checked out recently. I'm doing a bit of a dive of 2017, just as a personal project, sort of slowly in the background. And I came across this album and I just absolutely loved it immediately. And when I found out it was available, I sent it out as a wish list thing for Christmas, and my parents delivered. So this is Richard Edwards and Lemon Cotton Candy Sunset. Just wonderful album. I was expecting to like it. I like a lot of the stuff that he did with Margot and the Nuclear So-and-Sos. So when I came across it on the list, I thought, well, I'll definitely like this, but I was blown away. I absolutely loved it. It ended up being a very rare instant 5-star album for me. So I had to pick it up and own it in my collection. So I'm happy to say that I do now. And some other Christmas presents that I got this year. First up, we have Misadventures of Doomscroller by Dawes, which was one of the last essential Dawes albums that I was missing from my collection. They're a band I got into quite a long time ago, but have really grown to appreciate even more over the last couple years and get into their entire discography, whereas I was missing a few albums in the past. But they have a variance of quality, of course, and while everything is good, there are like 5 essential albums, and now I have them all, so I'm happy to say that. But I filled in that gap. Now I'll probably pick up the rest at some point, but it's not as important. And next up, someone who's pretty well, their entire output so far has been great and he never seems to miss. But this is my favorite album by him, and this is Ideal Man by Nashville musician Andrew Combs. Everything he puts out is gold. I don't think I've gone below 4.5 stars for his entire discography. And he had an album this past year in 2024, which made my top 25. Don't have it yet, but it's a wonderful album too. And he just never misses. But this one is his best, I think, so far. And I'm just happy to have it in the collection. Next up is another person who does not miss so far in his relatively short discography, but I'm happy to see where he goes in the future, and that is Cutworms. This is his first album, Hollow Ground. His self-titled from 2023 was my favorite album of that year. So out of over 400 albums that I heard, it was my number one. So yeah, I put him in pretty high regard. And this album, I don't know if it's sort of close in quality for me to the one from 2023. I love them both a lot. Which one is better than the other? It would probably depend on mood, honestly. I think they're both just stellar and fantastic. And yeah, I just love him and his vibe. Recently listened to a podcast where Richard Edwards, whose album I just showed not too long ago, talked about how much he loved one of Cutworms' albums, not this one, another one. And he just has some wonderful things to say about him. And I really liked how he described him. And he has sort of a classic sort of sound that you could mistake for being like derivative, I guess. But Richard had some way of putting it that it was more like it was just more appreciating that time period and putting his own stamp on it. And I think that's true. I really think he's really doing a great job with that. But I don't feel like he's doing just redoing like a 60s sound. He's obviously appreciates it a lot and he brings it into everything, but I think he brings his own unique stamp to it too as well. And brings it into the modern era. Next up, totally different time period. I've got I Knew Jesus Before He Was a Star by Glenn Campbell, which was an album that I found in my 1973 deep dive that actually did make my top 25 albums, which is a little unexpected because I love country music, especially country music from the 70s, but it's not necessarily a genre where it's filled with stellar albums. Like it's a lot of the albums have a few great songs, and then there's a lot of covers and often a lot of filler. But this album is an exception to that. And it was a bit unexpected, of course. I didn't necessarily, again, Glenn Campbell was great, of course. Don't get me wrong. But I wasn't necessarily expecting to find an album that didn't really have any big hit songs on it that I was aware of that was a solid album from beginning to end as well. Because, like I said, that is not really typical. So I've been looking for this album for a while and hoping to just come across it. And finally I did. So added it to the collection. And going back to more to the modern day, I have Girls, an album, which is an album that I first found when I was doing a dive for myself of 2009 to fill in those years. And I absolutely loved it right away. The singer, Christopher Owens, just has this great way about him. And the songwriting is just fantastic. And it gets better for me every time I hear it. And I'm going to talk about Christopher a little bit later, but this album is their best, I would say. They had two albums, which the second one is also great, and I think it gets overlooked a lot because this one was a big hype album when it came out, and it definitely seems to have a divisive opinions about it, but I just think it's wonderful. I absolutely loved it. So happy to add that. The next, I have a couple more albums that were on my top 25 of 2023. And they were both just situations where they came up really cheap, kind of randomly. And I had to grab them because up until this point, I just hadn't been able to pick them up. So I was happy to add them in. And that is first Rat Saw God by Wednesday, which is one that just keeps growing on me, just keeps getting better even as the year has gone on. So I'm happy to add that. And For Who the Bell Tolls For by Jonathan Rado, which I didn't ever think that I would end up getting on vinyl, to be honest, because it's a little more on the obscure side and I'd never seen it in a store. But it came up actually on Amazon of all places. I don't buy much records from there, but when it came up, it was $15 brand new, and it was for about half an hour. I just happened to get it in the window of time that it was that price, and then it skyrocketed back in price shortly after I bought it. So that was just luck, that one. And next up, got a couple of things I picked up on a trip downtown when I was doing some Christmas shopping, and got a couple of things for myself as well. The Strand of Oaks Heel, and this is an album from 2014, another one that I found doing my 2014 little mini dive, and I just fell in love with it from the get-go. Went back, I went and checked out all of his other albums after that, and I really liked them all for the most part. And then he had an album come out in 2024, which ended up being a little bit of a disappointment for me. Didn't like it as much, but there was one song on it that I really loved, Party at Monster Lake. And that ended up being one of my favorite songs of the year. So it's interesting to see where he goes next. That album didn't necessarily totally resonate with me, but he was doing some interesting things, and I'm curious to see where he takes it. But anyway, this album is wonderful as well, and I was happy to find it and pick it up. And tying back to Jonathan Rado, who I talked about just a minute ago, I have a couple albums from his previous band, Foxygen. And this one here, We Are the 21st Century Ambassadors of Peace and Magic, is probably my favorite album by them. It's just a stellar album. And this album and Star Power is a double album, which it's a bit of a mess, but there's some great stuff on it. And I came across it for a really good price, so I couldn't resist. I guess this is my problem and why I have to get rid of some stuff, because it's so easy to pick things up. But I have a much higher opinion of this than some of the things that I do end up getting rid of. So even though it's not like a 5-star album, it's still got enough on it that made it worth picking up for me. And we're getting to the end and getting to the 2024 stuff. But first, I have Dumb Waiters by the Corgis, which I found recently in a dive I am doing of 1980, and I'm working on making a list right now. This album, of course, has the classic Everybody's Got to Learn Sometime on it, but I think the rest of the album is really cool, and I was happy to pick it up because it's not on streaming for me in Canada. The only way I was able to hear it originally was on YouTube. So when I found it for $5 at my local record store, I was like, well, I know I like this a good bit, and I know that it's not easy for me to hear online. So to get a copy is a no-brainer, of course. So happy to add that one in. And a couple classics that I was missing up until this point. I've got Speaking in Tongues by the Talking Heads, or sorry, Talking Heads, not the Talking Heads. So sometimes I find that I end up overlooking buying classic albums or essential albums that everybody is supposed to own because I'm too busy buying things that maybe are a little more unexpected or things I don't see as often or, whatever. It's not because I don't love these classic albums, but I always think, oh, I'll get it later. Oh, I'll get it later. And sometimes it takes a while for later to come. But finally, I have corrected the wrong of not having Speaking in Tongues. Just like a lot of the original Beatles albums, I'm still missing a few of those, even though obviously I know them all very well and love them all, But for example, I still don't own a copy of Rubber Soul, even though I have known that album basically my whole life. So it's just one of those things. I try to get a little better about it and pick up some of those albums that are essentials so that I have them. I guess because I take for granted that they're always easily accessible, but that's not always true either. So anyway, that little aside, yeah, Talking Heads. And another classic album that I recently picked up, not because I've really been putting it off, more because I haven't come across it, and this was the first time I'd seen it, and that is Ram by Paul and Linda McCartney. Love this album, and I have a lot of his other solos and Wings stuff from the 70s. But this one, I don't know. A lot of people say that where they live, it's a dime a dozen, but I barely have ever seen it out and about. So I was happy to finally find a copy and be able to pick it up. I snatched it up right away because I've been looking for it for a while. So sometimes it's just a matter of not finding them too. Anyway, that's enough of that. On to some 2024 albums and some favorites from the year. Obviously, I'm not going to get into my whole list. I did make a top 100 list, and that is a lot to talk about in a video. And it just would become nonsense after a while, I think. But here are some of my favorites and some of the ones that I picked up. So first off, we have one that made my top 25. Let's see, what number did it end up at? Number 16 for the year. And that is Grace Cummings and her album Ramona. Now, this album, I was not sure what to think of at first. The first time I heard it, I was like, wow, this intrigues me and it's really cool, but I don't know if what I really think of it. I had to listen to it twice in a row the first day that I heard it, the day that it came out. I was first sort of alerted to its existence because Jonathan Wilson produced it, and he usually is like, he doesn't miss usually for me for the most part. Like a lot of the stuff he's produced, I end up really loving or at least liking. So that was kind of an indicator that I should check this out, even though I'd not heard of her at that point. And she has this powerful, like deep, gritty voice. And she puts so much emotional and feeling into it. And it's a very different kind of voice. And it certainly does not look like it comes out of this woman at all. Like, I must say, like, I was shocked that that's what she sounded like when I first heard the album. And it's got this sort of 60s pop approach, like orchestral kind of, I don't know. kind of pop approach to it. It's not like pop songs like Bubblegum or anything, but like more of like, I guess more in the style of like what Scott Walker would have been doing in the late 60s, I guess. And I don't know. She gives me chills every time I listen to this album. So it just kept rising for me and getting better. Like I had it probably in the middle of my list, sort of in my working list throughout the year. But when I went back to everything at the end of the year, I was just like, wow, this still gets me every time I hear it. So I had to put it up a bit. And I actually came across it randomly recently at my mall record store, which they usually have mostly fairly basic stuff. So I was pretty surprised to find this there. So I grabbed it and yeah, it was a bit of an unexpected purchase. And next for a 2024 release that also produced by Jonathan Wilson, actually, and one that I was not necessarily super excited for, despite loving this artist for quite a while now. But that is Father John Misty and Mahatma Shana. um, so I fell in love with Father John Misty in the I Love You Honey Bear era in 2015. I wasn't listening to a lot of new music then. I had a lot going on in my life. I had young children. So I was pretty busy. But I came across that album from a Rolling Stone article, and I was intrigued by it because he'd been the drummer from Fleet Foxes, who was a band that I really liked at the time and still like, of course, but they really resonated with me right away. So to learn that he was part of that group, I was like, oh, okay, and that sounds interesting. And I absolutely loved that album just immediately. It took over my year. It was really the main album I listened to that was a new release in that year. And of course, I went back to Fear Fun as well, which had been his previous album. And I followed him all along and I eagerly anticipated every release as they came out. Then, of course, in 2022, he had an album come out that was called Chloe and the Next 20th Century. I was super excited for this album. I could not wait. It had been, I think, 4 years since his previous album after him putting out a bunch pretty close together. So I was super anticipating this album. It was a huge letdown for me. I did not love it. I still liked it, but he was at such a high level that just merely liking it was not enough and was just a massive letdown. So that feeling sort of lingered. Even though I still loved everything before it, and there were some songs I really liked on it. I was just not that excited for this new album cycle. I was kind of like, oh yeah, new Father John Misty, okay. And it came out sort of closer to the end of the year and at the end of November. But as soon as I heard that first song, Mahash Mashana, I was like, he could be back. And he was. This album has just gotten better and better for me. In my original list that I even made in the middle of December, I had it in the top 25, but I think it was around number 19. But I would say that it's actually skyrocketed to my top 10, and really that's where it should fall. So really it's ended up being around number 6 of the year for me. I'd have to revisit, but I don't know. I keep going back to it. I love it, and it's really just keeps growing on me. So it's not fair to keep it behind some other things that also really liked, but this is just next level, and it's so exciting when an artist that you love brings things back after a bit of a disappointment. So I'm just so happy that I love this album and that he has brought something that makes me feel that love for him again. So yes, Mahash Mashana, it's just great. It just keeps getting better, and maybe will continue to get better. I don't know. It's just great, and I'm happy that I got to pick it up, because it was actually quite hard to find when I went to get it. I had to go to a few different record stores in my area to actually pick up a copy. So yeah. So next I got Manning Fireworks by MJ Lenderman, which is my number 3 album of the year. I also really liked his 2022 album. That's when he first went on my radar. And then he is also a member of Wednesday, whose album I showed earlier. So he's kind of always been in the background the last few years, but I was super excited for this. I really liked the singles, and I knew it was going to be an album that I really liked, or at least I hoped. I hoped it didn't let me down, and it didn't. I immediately loved it. For a while, I thought it was my favorite album of the year, but it just didn't quite seem right to be my number one. So it ended up at number three, but it's still a 5-star album. I had three this year, so it is one of the three, of course. And yeah, it's just fantastic. I love his writer voice. He's got a bit of a dry sense of humor in his lyrics, which doesn't work for everybody. It didn't work for Anthony Fantano famously, but I think it's great. And I think just on this album, he really brought up the songwriting. Like, I liked both songs from 2022, but my favorite song on it, TLC Cage Match, I think he brings that vibe from that song and really expands on it with this album and makes an album full of songs on that level for me. So yeah, that's my number three. And my number one of the year I was also able to pick up, and that is Christopher Owens and I Want to Run Barefoot Through Your Hair. It's just, this album is just such a beautiful emotional experience. He went through some really hard stuff before making this album in the last few years. He was homeless for a while after his fiance broke up with him. He was living in his car. Well, first he was living in a trailer that he had, and then the trailer got stolen and they stole his cat and his guitar. And then he had to live in his car, and his former bandmate from Girls, which is the album I showed earlier, passed away in 2020. So he went through a lot of stuff, and you feel that emotion on this album, but it's not a downer. It's there's hope there, there's beauty there, and it's just an album that if you get into it, you can really feel a connection to it. And I liked it right away. It came out late in the year. It came out in October. I really liked it. I went back to it a few times, but I kept feeling like I got to keep going back to this. And then when I was making my list and I listened to it and I had a really focused listen and a quiet evening with some headphones just by myself, and that's when it hit me. I was like, this is the best album this year. This is it. I knew then. I was struggling trying to figure out that top album. I wasn't sure at that point until that listen of this. And there is just so many textures and so much beauty to this album within the lyrics and within just the music and the accompaniment. And every time I listen, I feel I hear new textures and new things that stand out and new moments in the songs that get me every time. So it's just extra special. So of course, out of all the albums I heard this year, and I heard a lot, I go pretty all in on new releases. This is very easily the number one and the best, and one of the ones that will stick for a long time and be a classic for me. So yeah, so with that, I thought I'd talk about a couple more just briefly. I'm not going to get too far into it, but in my top 10, I have a few others that I picked up a while back, and that we have Plunge by Sam Evian. That ends up in the top 10. It was number 6, but actually I think now it would be more number 7 because I do think that the Father John Misty album does go ahead of it for me now that I've had more time with it. And I still love this, obviously. Top 10 of the year. That's nothing to sneeze at. And it was for a while when it first came out, it was my favorite for a long time. It came out earlier in the year, I think in March or April. So it was a favorite for the beginning part of the year, but I mean, other things that came out that kind of brought it down a little bit, but still great. And of course, the Lemon Twigs with A Dream Is All We Know. Not my favorite Lemon Twigs album, but still a great one. I mean, they are always winning, I think. And this is an album of great catchy pop songs, and they stick with you. And I find different ones to love every time. And I do think that it's another one that'll stand the test of time. I like when they're a little weirder too with their pop songs, and this is a lot more straight ahead. But if that's my only quibble, that's not really that big of a quibble. They're still great songs, and it's still a very enjoyable album. So it's still in the top 10. I think it actually is my number 5 of the year. Yes. So yeah, the Lemon Twigs, they all pretty well always win for me as of right now, and I look forward to seeing what they do in the future. And another one that I have that I picked up, it doesn't have the most remarkable covers, so I don't have it displayed. That's the self-titled Dr. Dog album. And that is probably closer to number 8 or 9 in the top 10 now. Everything's really close. I find it's a little bit difficult to order them in at that point. Like from the number 4 to like number 10 era, everything's a little bit it's there's room for it to kind of shift around a little bit. But where I landed when I made my list would put it at number 8 for the year. So a few other albums that I don't own yet that were in my top 10 and that I love and that I would recommend for the year would be To Shoot Another Day by Rosalie Cunningham, which is my number 2 album of the year. I just have not been able to come across it just yet. So I hope I do eventually because I just think it's an awesome album. It's another one that came out late in the year, but it's one that immediately stuck with me and got repeated listens. And I think she's bringing in a lot of 70s influences, but she's doing it in a way that is unique to her. Like it feels like she has a unique voice making this music. She's not just doing a pastiche, like she's doing something really cool and inventive. And her songwriting has really reached its peak at this point, I think, because I heard some of her previous albums after really loving this album, and they were not quite to this level. Like they're still good. I still enjoyed them, but this, I feel like she's really coming to her own on this one. So I'm excited to see what she has in the future, and I hope I have to get to add the album to my collection eventually. That was another 5-star for me for the year, so it's really awesome. Number 4 of the year that I also don't own is the drummer from Dr. Dog's solo album, and that is Eric Slick in his album New Age Rage. It's just, it was a mainstay, especially throughout the summer. It has a very like funky, danceable kind of vibe, but in a like I feel like it's a very inventive way. He takes a lot of influences and he brings them together, and he just makes these catchy songs that get stuck in your head and really fit a good time kind of vibe, but also some really interesting lyrics and really thought-provoking at times too. So just really love that album that all year. So it pretty well was a mainstay within that top 5 realm. And I mentioned a bunch of the other ones in the middle, and then rounding out the top 10 would be Adrienne Lenker's Bright Future, which is just a beautiful, emotional singer-songwriter album. She knocks it out of the park on that. And R.I.P. Dunes, which is the singer from the band Caveman, is his own project. And I just immediately loved it. It was one of my favorites in the early part of the year when I was struggling to find a lot to really, really love at that point. But that was one that was like an immediate like aha moment. And I just really liked his songwriting and his approach to things. And yeah, it's one that remained a favorite throughout the year and didn't really ever miss for me. Like every time I went back to it, it was just as strong as I remembered it being. So I was happy to have that one rounded at the top 10. But anyway, I'm not going to get too far into anything else. I will share a link in the description of my top 100 list if you're interested. But yes, otherwise, those were the best albums of the year for me as of right now. Of course, as time goes on, I sometimes discover things later on that kind of shift things around. I had that happen a lot with 2022, actually. I found a lot of things after the fact that I absolutely loved that sort of knocked out things that I enjoyed in the year. So you just never know. That's just the great thing about music is there's always things coming out and you're always finding out things and having new discoveries and adding to the collection. There's just too much great music, actually. And new music, old music, doesn't matter. Anyway, enough rambling. That is my collection update. Probably won't be another one for a while. I don't expect to bring in too much the next little bit. This time of year, it doesn't really seem like there's too much happening. So anyway, till next time, bye.